Okay, welcome to week 5 of Advanced Criminological Theory. This is past the midpoint. You've made it past the midway point. Be sure to remember your term paper due dates are coming up a lot quicker than you think. So make sure, hopefully, you're making good progress on your papers. This week we talk about homicide, violence, family violence, that sort of issue. Be sure to read the 2 chapters assigned in the textbook, and let me see what I can add to or clarify from that material. First, I want to start by saying that some folks have suggested that violence is a part of who we are as Americans. In 1969, Davis and Gurr suggest that violence in the United States is rooted in our history, and in particular they name 6 historical events that are deeply embedded in our national character. They start with noting the revolutionary doctrine that is expounded in the Declaration of Independence. Second, they talk about our prolonged frontier experience, which tended to legitimize violence and vigilantism. Third is a competitive hierarchy of immigrants that is highly conducive to violence. Next is a pervasive fear of government power, which has reinforced a tendency to define freedom negatively as freedom from something, rather than freedom to do or freedom to something. It's freedom from. Think of our Christian lifestyle. Often we tend to think of salvation as freeing us from sin, but when perhaps we'd be better served in thinking of our salvation as a freedom to choose, freedom to choose life, freedom to choose a life of service, freedom to worship God, rather than freedom from something. Next, they talk about the Industrial Revolution and the great migration from rural areas to the city. This caused widespread social dislocation, social disorganization, poverty, unemployment, etc., etc. And then lastly, Davis and Gurr mention the unmatched prosperity that is combined with an unequal distribution of wealth, an unequal distribution of opportunity, which produces a revolution, what they call a revolution of rising expectations, in which improved economic rewards coincide with relative deprivation, which can, in those that are denied equal opportunity and equal access or equal distribution of wealth, you see that it generates frustration and violence, kind of a Marxian look at things. Add to the 6 that Davis and Gurr suggest, add to slavery and its legacy of racially motivated violence in this country, and from the very beginning, our near genocide, or the near genocide of Native Americans and their culture. And you can possibly see their argument that violence has been a part of the American culture from the beginning, maybe even more so than some other nations. Consider, for instance, the American values. We value life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Compare that to the stated Canadian value system of peace, order, and good government. And you can see kind of a switch there. Hopefully you're being entertained by my cats, who are cheerfully playing with one another. Okay, some definitions to get us started talking about homicide and violence. First, talk about criminal homicide, which is causing the death of another person without legal justification or excuse. This can be murder or non-negligent murder, the difference being malice aforethought. Murder being a very intentional, premeditated taking of life, as opposed to non-negligent murder, which is spontaneous. It's not. There's no malice aforethought. There's no I'm going to go kill this guy. It's more like non-negligent murder is more like I got into a bar fight and got really mad and decided, I'm going to kill this blankety blankety blank, and you go out and do it. You didn't plan ahead. You didn't plan. There was no premeditation. You just got really mad at somebody and killed them. Whoops. Then there's negligent homicide. This is the killing of another as a result of reckless or culpable negligence. Recklessness or culpable negligence, excuse me. The idea is that even though the intent to kill is not present, the law says the person should still be held accountable, that the person should have known that their actions would result in the death of another. An example would be, let's say I built a house. I'm a general contractor. I built a house. I used substandard materials, knowing full well that the materials I used to build the house could have caused the structure to collapse and cause injury or kill somebody. But I'm looking to save a buck or two. I don't know, maybe I'm tied to the mob or something. And the house collapses, kills everyone inside. That's negligent homicide. I recklessly ignored the danger to human life. Conducted my dangerous act anyway. These idiots on the 4th of July and New Year's Eve that like to fire their guns in the air, which, by the way, is extremely stupid thing to do, because the law of physics, real simple idea. What goes up must come down. Because I can't think of the firearm that's available on the open market that can reach escape velocity. Unfortunately, when that little piece of lead that you shoot in the air as celebration, as it comes down, it reaches terminal velocity, and probably hits someone harder than it would if you had actually shot them. That would be negligent homicide. So, if you're one of these people that likes to shoot their guns up in the air in celebration, I'd say no offense, but I don't care if I offend you or not. I think you're an idiot. I think you're a moron, and you should never even consider being a cop. And two, it's criminal. It's negligent homicide if you kill somebody in this manner. It doesn't matter if you meant to or not. And then the last definition I have for you is assault. This is intentionally inflicting bodily injury on another, or the intent to inflict such injury. Assault becomes aggravated when there is the use when a weapon is involved, or the infliction of serious bodily injury. Which means, if I'm Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris and I go wailing on somebody, and even if I just use my hands and feet, if I cause enough injury that my victim needs medical attention, then I have just turned my assault into aggravated assault. You don't have to be Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris to commit aggravated assault with your hands. If you hit someone hard enough with your bare hand, or you kick them hard enough that they need medical attention. If they have to go to the emergency room and a doctor has to treat a cut, doctor has to do anything medically, that becomes aggravated assault. So keep that in mind next time you get in a bar fight. I advise stay out of bar fights. All right, let me talk about sociological correlates of homicide. First, I talk about sociological correlate. Let's start with race. Everyone's least favorite one to talk about. We talk about race and ethnicity in relation to homicide. Understand that blacks are involved both as offenders and victims in homicide at a rate disproportionate to their representation in society. In other words, African Americans make up about 13% of the U.S. population, give or take. They represent about 37% of all arrests for homicide. Disproportionate. Keep in mind, this is UCR data, and all the problems that come with UCR data. Homicide in particular tends to be intra-racial. In other words, African Americans tend to kill other African Americans, whites tend to kill other whites, Hispanics tend to kill other Hispanics, etc., etc. If you want to put some percentages on it, about 92% of African American victims were killed by another African American. 85% of white murder victims were killed by a white person. Why, you might ask, why the disproportionate representation of blacks in the arrest data then? This is probably due to social inequalities, such as social inequalities related to employment, education, racial oppression, discriminatory treatment of minorities by the criminal justice system itself, law enforcement practices in the inner city neighborhoods. I do want to make one thing extremely clear. Even though African Americans make up around 37% of arrests for homicide, there is no racial predisposition towards violence. This was something that was believed 50s, 60s, 1950s, 1960s, and before. Blacks were thought to be just naturally violent people, and the thinking of the time by the rich white people were, blacks bring it on themselves. It's who they are. They can't help themselves. That's all bull. You know what I'm not saying. It's all BS. There is no racial predisposition towards violence or homicide. The people that have said that in the past, they're all wrong. We've talked about blacks and Caucasians at this point. Hispanics and Latinos, they more like whites. They make up about 12% of the population and about 12% of arrests for violent crimes. So about equal to their proportion in society. Reality is Hispanic, Latino victimization rates tend to be lower than that of both blacks and whites. We don't know why. All right, get away from race. Let's talk about gender differences. Just one little thing I would tell you. Gender, as far as gender and homicide, most homicide victims and offenders are male. 90% of all murder arrests are male offenders. 77% of all murder victims, are men. Doesn't that make you feel better, ladies? That you know that your likelihood of being murdered is much lower than us guys. I'm not sure that we deserve it, but that's the way it is. Let's see. Age. 50% of people arrested for homicide. 50% of all those arrested for homicide are between ages 20 and 29. People under the age of 25 make up 50% of all of those arrested for murder or non-negligent homicide. The highest offending rate is among young black males between ages 18 and 22. And when I say highest offending rate, again, keep in mind this is UCR data. And keep in mind all those reasons why the data makes it look like blacks commit more murders. Again, talking about age, referring to juveniles, about 11% of all homicides are committed by juveniles, mostly male juveniles. Only 2% by those under the age of 15. If we talk about victims of juvenile homicide, we're looking at mostly single male victims. 58% of victims are also juvenile. Parents rarely are victims of juvenile murder. Juvenile murderers, those who commit murders that are juveniles, tend to have a history of severe educational difficulties or learning disability, and they are more often than not diagnosed with a variety of mental disorders. Let's see, socioeconomic class. The link between socioeconomic class and overall crime has been largely debated. There seems to be a relationship between low socioeconomic class and adult crimes that come to the attention of the police, largely because family violence tends to go unreported in upper class neighborhoods. Oh, what else do I want to talk about? How about victim offender relationships? Most murder victims know their attackers. Only 13% of murder victims did not know their attacker. So murder is a very intimate, very personal crime, and one that is largely carried out by someone known to the victim. But the only time these stats are skewed any is when we start talking about serial killers. Because serial killers, well, male serial killers, and we'll get into this later, male serial killers tend to kill strangers. But by and large, we're talking about normal killers, not psychotic serial killer nutcases. And no, that's not a technical term. Normally, murders are very intimate and personal crimes. 33% of female victims were killed by their husbands or their boyfriends. Congratulations, ladies. 2.7% of male victims were killed by their wives and girlfriends. In other words, if you're married, wives, you're more likely to be killed by your husbands than your husband is likely to be killed by you. Men are, and ladies, you'll feel a lot better. You'll feel a little bit better about this when I get much later when I talk about female serial killers. Men are victimized by strangers at about twice the rate of women. And let's see what else I got here for you. 28 murders, or 28% of murders, tend to be the result of some sort of argument or verbal conflict between the participants. And about 16.5% of murders are committed in the process of another felony. Let's see. Let's talk about weapons. Guns and knives tend to be the preferred instrument of death when it comes to homicide in the United States. Largely firearms, which are involved in about 70% of all homicides in the U.S., and mostly we're talking about handguns here. While there's a stereotypical image of the drive-by with some idiot leaning outside of a car with an Uzi, the reality is most murders in the United States are carried out with handguns. And then, our last correlate is time. Homicides are equally distributed out throughout the year, so there isn't a period of the year where homicides become more common. Keep in mind that for other types of crime, particularly property crime, that seems to be seasonal, that summertime property crimes tend to increase, largely because juveniles that are predisposed towards property crime are not in school during the summer, and so they got more time to steal your stuff. Which is also, most people go on vacation during the summer, and so there's more opportunity for people to steal your stuff. But when we're talking about murder, seasonal, it's not seasonal. Equally distributed throughout the year. Time of day tends to matter, as homicide rates are highest between 8 a.m. on Saturday and 2 a.m. on Sunday. Alright, that's enough about generic stuff about murder. Okay, my notes are going to be in a funny order. Forgive me, I don't feel like rewriting them on the fly. I'll come back to murder in a little while when I talk about multiple murder. But before I get into multiple murder, and again, I have no idea why I structured my notes this way. You'll just have to bear with me. Before I talk about multiple murder, I'd like to talk about domestic violence or family violence. And we can refer to this by several terms. We can call it family violence, domestic violence. Really, what scholars like myself, the term scholars such as myself and other professors, term that is really preferred is intimate partner violence. In fact, if there are any of you that have picked domestic violence as your term paper topic, you may consider switching and using intimate partner violence. Domestic violence tends to have this connotation that you're just talking about the marriage relationship, and intimate partner violence implies violence that occurs not just in the marriage relationship, but between boyfriends and girlfriends, domestic partners, people that are living together. It includes people that are living together, homosexuals living together in civil, what do you call civil unions, that sort of thing. Okay, how do I define all this thing with which we'll use different terms? I'll probably use intimate personal violence or IPV, and I may use domestic violence. But keep in mind, I'm referring, whichever term I'm using, I'm talking about the same thing. How I define this, I'll define it as any assault or other criminal offense that results in personal injury or death, in the personal injury or death of one family or household member by another, often refers not just to a single incident, but rather a pattern of abusive behavior between domestic partners. What we know about intimate partner violence is it is grossly underreported. Any cop can tell you, in fact, the police officers that are in this class can tell you that most of the time, when this comes to the police's attention, it has already become a pattern of behavior. It is something that largely has happened more than once before somebody thinks to involve the police. Arrest data indicates that IPV is more common among African Americans, but then other ethnic minority groups, this is not as well documented. And so while arrest data says this, don't take it as the gospel truth, or maybe as even an accurate picture of reality. I remember UCR data is really a good scholar doesn't use UCR data as an indication of crime, but rather an indication of how active the police are. Okay, just a few, we'll call them myths. Just kind of a few random thoughts about family violence, or IPV, intimate partner violence. First is that violence doesn't necessarily beget violence. In other words, just because someone was abused in childhood doesn't necessarily mean they will become abusers themselves, though that is common. Adult offenders often claim abuse as children, but when we start looking into those, you get the adult offender, and they're trying to use a mitigating circumstance for when in sentencing. They say, "I was abused as a kid, and that's why I abused my wife." And what really happens is there's no real strong documentation to prove that. We know, children of abuse tend to be more likely to become abusers themselves. We know that witnessing domestic violence as a child increases the likelihood, but there generally isn't any strong documentation to support that. Domestic violence cuts across socioeconomic, religious, racial, and ethnic lines. It happens everywhere. It happens in every social class. It happens within every ethnic group. It happens within every belief system. It happens everywhere. Alcohol and other drug use. Again, this is something with a relationship, but it makes the problem worse, but it doesn't cause. It's not a cause of domestic violence, but rather it makes things worse. Sometimes it's about the male's perceived loss of power. Those are just some of the generic thoughts about domestic violence. Now let me get into some specific stuff, and here you can start taking notes again. Except for that type A personality that's been trying to transcribe my lectures. Silly child. Okay, what do we know about the prevalence, incidence, and nature of intimate personal violence, intimate partner violence? Intimate partner violence, about 20% of violent crimes against women are IPV. With same-sex domestic violence, there has in years been increased attention. We know it is happening. The idea that gay couples are just gay and happy, they have the same problems as heterosexual couples. They about the same, as far as we know, about the same rate of intimate partner violence. stuff happens. Let's see. One other thing I want to know is that there are fewer support services available for victims of same-sex violence. And see, that's, I don't want to say anything, I don't want to support certain lifestyles, but if there is domestic violence going on in same-sex relationships, there still needs those individuals still need help, and where they don't get the services are not there for them. All right, types of domestic violence. Let's get some types. First type I give you is physical violence. This is defined as any physical act intended to injure, harm, or disable an intimate partner. Probably could have figured that one out on your own, right? There is psychological violence. This includes threats or coercive acts that seek to overpower and control the victim. Some examples include social isolation, ridiculing, shouting, swearing, name-calling. The psychological violence tends to get minimized by both researchers and service agencies, especially when there is physical violence present in the relationship. Type 3, sexual violence. This is sexual contact without the consent of the victim. Keep in mind, for much of U.S. history, this was not considered a crime. Up until the last few decades, the marriage relationship was considered to have consent for sex built into it. That males had a right, husbands had a right to have sex with their wives. Wives didn't have the right to refuse. And so for a very long time, there was no such thing legally as rape inside the marriage relationship. Fortunately, laws have changed, and there is no state in the Union now where consent for sexual intercourse is implied in the marriage relationship. And so, yes, rape can occur, or sexual assault can occur within the marriage relationship. Just because you're married to someone doesn't mean that you don't have the right to deny sexual intercourse if you don't want to, and husbands do not have authority to force that on their wives. Financial abuse. Next type, I guess it's the 4. Financial abuse is controlling finances without knowledge, consent, or input from a partner. This also includes things like preventing a partner from earning her own money or his own money, or preventing a partner from pursuing an education. So it's not just controlling the finances, controlling the money, but it's also taking action to prevent the partner from being able to generate their own income or increase their level of education, which might lead to increased income. Let's see, type 5, spiritual abuse. This is one that is largely ignored, but certainly is a very real type of abuse, or a very real type of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. This involves preventing a partner from engaging in spiritual activities, such as attending a church, or the use of scripture to justify abuse within the relationship. And then a final type is stalking. Of course, stalking is something that generally occurs after the relationship has ended, and this is defined as willful, repeated, and malicious following of another individual. There are obviously serious consequences for domestic violence. The most obvious of which is physical trauma, increased risk of developing chronic injury or disease, chronic pain. But victims experience more than just the physical harm, the bruises and the injuries. Consequence of domestic violence can go towards things like victims experiencing greater than average symptoms of things like fainting, hypertension, and gastrointestinal disorders like loss of appetite, things like that. The fear and stress that comes along with domestic violence can lead to chronic health issues of its own, or can lead to lifestyle risk behaviors. Things like smoking and drinking and substance use can be a result of the stress and fear that comes from domestic violence. In women, domestic violence can lead to gynecological and reproductive issues, such as the taking on of STDs or preterm labor. Other consequences for domestic violence include impaired psychological functioning, including depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, which of course then can make other health issues worse. Victimization. This type of victimization can also lead towards suicidal ideation, self-harm, and possibly actual suicide. Other consequences of domestic violence also include occupational economic difficulties. Victims may have difficulty seeking or finding employment, whether they are prevented from gaining employment or just have a poor work history because they've been unable to maintain employment. It comes down to, if the wife's being beaten, she's got to call in. If the wife's being physically abused, the husband's being physically abused, and yes, guys, it does happen. Not all domestic violence is male on female. Quite a bit of domestic violence out there is a wife beating up on her husband. It just doesn't get as reported as often because, what guy wants to admit to the cops that his wife beat him up? But either way, the abused partner has to use their sick days more often, will have unexcused absences, sometimes have to quit altogether to avoid embarrassment or because they're told to. And so the inability to maintain employment then affects their ability to find future employment. And then the economic difficulty is also related to vulnerability in domestic violence, in that it prevents the partner from leaving because they're so economically dependent upon the abusing partner that they don't feel like they can get out. Let's see. Not only are the direct victim affected, there are consequences of domestic violence for children as well. This depends on the risk factors, how old the child is, the nature of the violence, things like that. But overall, children who witness domestic violence have more behavioral and emotional problems. These can be both externalized. The child may become more aggressive. Could be internalized, where the child becomes very fearful and withdrawn. Domestic violence also has effects on the child's cognitive structures, their attitudes, their cognitive abilities. And then finally, there's an annual cost for intimate partner violence in increased healthcare expenses alone. Intimate partner violence costs the American public around $19.3 million a year. All right, so how do men, women become at risk for victimization? Some of the risk factors for becoming that may make someone vulnerable to being a victim of domestic violence include mental and physical health problems, economic concerns, substance abuse. These are both risk factors and consequences of domestic violence, and so that domestic violence becomes a very nasty circle. Your health problems, your poverty, your economic problems, your substance abuse makes you vulnerable to domestic violence, and the domestic violence occurs, and those problems get worse as a result of the domestic violence, and so the person becomes even more vulnerable to domestic violence. Yada, 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 you get the point. Other consequences include social phobia, which has been associated with increased risk for severe violence victimization. Substance dependence, on the other hand, seems to be associated with a decreased risk for severe violence. Why? Other risk factors include traditional sex role or gender role beliefs, and a trauma history, increased vulnerability to domestic violence. As some women, there are some women who endorse. Some women that endorse traditional marriage relationship roles are more likely to condone the violence and remain with an intimate partner despite the abuse. Exposure to violence as a child increases the odds that someone will accept violence as a normal way to settle disputes. Junior grows up watching mommy and daddy beat each other up every time they have an argument, and that's how we socialize. That's how Junior is socialized to believe that mommies and daddies handle their problems. And then finally, there are some social factors. Social isolation also contributes. Could be as much as little as living in a rural area, or through the actions of the abuser. These things can prevent reporting. Okay, risk factors for things that put an individual at risk for becoming an abuser, and there are some of those. Some of the more common things include age, substance abuse, mental health problems like personality disorders or depression, a dependency, and I'm not talking about substance dependency, I'm talking about a dependency on others, and then witnessing or experiencing violence as a child. For example, substance use tends to lower an individual's inhibitions, which then again increases the risk of violence and the rationalization of violence. Attachment or dependency on a victim may also be a risk factor. The person is so dependent or so emotionally attached to the individual that they feel the need that they have to control the other person out of fear of being abandoned or losing that attachment. There are some community factors, things like poverty, low social capital, inadequate sanctions for domestic violence. And then there are some social factors. Social factors. Excuse me. I'm here. Social factors such as traditional gender roles, social norms that increase the risk. Increased tolerance and acceptance of domestic violence. And then the last thing for domestic violence that I would like to talk about, and then I think I'll end this segment and go to choir rehearsal, is, and there's a lot of different theories about domestic violence, and I think I'm only going to get into one, and this is called the one that I want to get into is referred to a nested ecological theory. And according to this theory, and this one makes quite a bit of sense. I think you'll like it. It's hard to say you like something about domestic violence, but anyway, the nested ecological theory suggests that individual characteristics occur against a backdrop of the family system, the circumstances under which the abuse occurs, and then a larger social context of cultural values. And then specifically kind of put this in a more specifically individual characteristics, things like psychological dysfunction, mental disorder, things like that, will interact with situational determinants, stress, intoxication, to create this. So the individual characteristics, they interact with situational determinants to create violent outcomes. And then the theory goes on to identify 4 different levels of factors that contribute to domestic violence. These 4 levels include, the first one is macro system. These are cultural beliefs and values that influence the development of the individual, influence the development of social and family systems. These are things like patriarchal beliefs, traditional gender role expectations. So this would be like a situational determinant, maybe. Second is the exosystem. These are your formal and informal social structures that influence the individual. These are your friends, your workplace, your education, income, stuff like that. The third level is the microsystem. These are these are your situational determinants. These are your circumstances leading up to and surrounding the abuse incident. There's things like jealousy, marital separation, stress, intoxication, like that. And then finally, ontogenic, O-N-T-O-genic. These are individual characteristics of the abuser. These are things like personality dysfunction, poor coping mechanism, substance abuse, anger, and cognition. Okay, that's going to be it for domestic violence in part 1 of this video series. Say hi to Julius. Hi, criminology students. Yeah, he looks happy, right? In the next part, I will talk about multiple murder. Be sure to read the textbook where it talks about spree murder and multiple murder, because while I'll define those in part 2, I'm really going to concentrate on serial murder. Serial killers, because, hey, that's what students are most interested in, and, it's just fascinating stuff. So, anyway, that's the end of this part.